Behind me is the Roman Forum of Philippi. Now, a forum is sometimes called an agora, and in our Bible, the word is often translated marketplace.
On the north side of the courtyard were two monumental fountains.
And then between those fountains, there's something called a bema, often called a judgment seat. You see, here in Philippi, when a person was accused of a crime, this is where they could be brought to be tried publicly. And if convicted, punished publicly. Now, there was an incident that took place while the Apostle Paul was here in Philippi. It involved a slave girl
Whose owners became furious with Paul after he cast a demon out of the girl. And then the owners, they lost the income she earned by telling people's fortunes.
We read in Acts chapter 16 that these owners seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace in order to face the authorities. And the magistrate, he just commands that Paul and Silas be stripped publicly, beaten, and then tossed in jail for the night. You see, Philippi is not what you might call a Jesus-friendly place. There was incredible opportunity here, but also incredible pain. You see, and this wasn't the last time something like this would happen. 10 years after the event here, the Apostle Paul is under arrest and awaiting trial. And Paul's friends here in Philippi, they wonder how he's doing with all this. I mean, when will his case come up for trial? If convicted, could this lead to execution? And how does Paul feel about all this? See, that's a huge question, isn't it? Because we can't always control the events that bombard our lives, but we do have control over our response to those events. And so today we open Philippians and see Paul's report to his friends. Hear the voice of the inmate. Listen to the voice of the prisoner, because in his words, we will find some outstanding wisdom in finding joy during seasons of uncertainty.
Well, good morning. And welcome to part 3 of our fall series. Those of you worshiping with us at our other campuses, I'm just so pleased that we get to be together today for this important conversation. So a question to start at, when was the last time you had to stop by the Secretary of State, like to get your license renewed or something like that? Has it been recently for any of you, Secretary of State visit? For those of you who watch, who are not from Michigan, you probably call this the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, but here in our fine state, it's the Secretary of State. I found myself waiting there some time ago in order to get my license removed. In fact, one of the cool things was that when I went up to get my picture taken for my new license, the woman behind the counter actually let me inspect that picture to decide whether or not I liked it. How many of you like your driver's license pictures? So with all of the enthusiasm I could summon, she said, "Is this okay?" I said, "Oh, yes. I'll have a dozen wallet size, 3 5x7s and 1 8.5 by 11. And she looked at me with a perfectly straight face and she said, "That's funny." I've never heard that one before. It's just great to be a ray of sunshine to someone's life. But something was cool in the waiting room last time I was at the Secretary of State was there was a new installment, maybe it's been there for years, but it had been a while, which was this right here, flat screen TV. It was cool for 2 things. Number one, they issue you a number, and then you can see where you are on the list. Am I number 6, number 18, number 24? And you can actually see your number go up on the list and say, okay, I'm 10th, next, or 6th next, or I'm next, But right up here, total forecast wait, 29 minutes. And that's cool, because if you walk in and you just look at the flat screen, and it says, wait, an hour and 45 minutes, you go, I think I'm gonna do this another day, right? So you have an idea how long you're gonna wait and where you are in the line. Let's just agree on something together this morning, that sometimes when we find ourselves in a waiting room, we don't get to decide whether to be there or not. And a lot of times when we find ourselves stuck in a waiting room in life, we have no idea how long we're gonna be stuck sitting there. Waiting is one of the hardest things we will ever do. I had one friend say, listen, Jeff, I can deal with not having cancer. I can deal with having cancer. I can't deal with not knowing whether or not I have cancer and waiting for this diagnosis. Waiting can be frustrating. Waiting can be exasperating. Waiting can be infuriating. The question is, how in the world can you keep your soul healthy and your heart alive to God and alive to other people when you are stuck in some waiting room and you didn't choose to be there and you have no idea how long this waiting experience will last? And in our study today, our main character is stuck in a waiting room. His name is the Apostle Paul, and we've got just a map here to be able to follow him in his waiting. You would find the backstory in the chapters of the Bible, Acts chapter 21 through 28. Our series is embedded in his letter to the Philippians, but that's where you'd find the backstory to his imprisonment. It starts way over here in Jerusalem where Paul is visiting the temple. Some enemies see him. They throw these accusations. It's kind of a mob scene. And the Apostle Paul gets himself arrested there in Jerusalem. Just north of Jerusalem and over on the coast is the city of Caesarea. That is the Roman capital of Judea because Judea had been conquered by the Romans. In fact, just in the name Caesarea, you see the name Caesar. This is Caesarea right there in Israel. And Paul is carted there, and there he will sit for 2 stinking years in a cell. Why? Well, the governor, the Roman governor in Judea is hoping to get a bribe. 2 years, that's 104 weeks. That's like 700 days of immobility. 700 days of confinement while some shady bureaucrat is hoping for a bribe. Finally, that governor gets recalled and a new governor is selected. And when this new governor is selected, finally Paul says, listen, I'm done. I appeal to the emperor in Rome. And as a Roman citizen, you could do that. And they say, okay, off to Rome you will go. And the Apostle Paul sails from Caesarea toward Rome. There's a shipwreck on the way. There's a further delay. And finally he arrives in Rome. He doesn't know this, but he will sit in Rome for 2 more years. Waiting for his case to come to trial. Now, when Paul is in prison in Rome, he is not in a dungeon. He is in a rented house, think apartment. And don't think don't think luxury condo here. He probably had a room or two that he rented. But when Paul writes about the experience repeatedly, what he writes about is his chains. The dude is chained up in this room. Same room or 2 rooms, same 4 walls, same window with 1 view. He has been robbed of his freedom. He has been robbed of his mobility. He's been robbed of his capacity to travel. He has been robbed of variety in life. Now listen, he has been he will be stuck in this waiting room for a 4-year incarceration between Caesarea and Rome. And the question is, Paul, I got a question. How in the world do you keep your heart alive when you're stuck in some stinking waiting room? How can the soul thrive when you didn't ask to be there, you don't want to be there, and you do not know how long this will last? And when Paul's case does come to trial, it's either going to lead toward his arrest or his execution. So there's what he's living out in the present with his chains, and there's also this kind of future uncertainty thing that is going on. So I just want to know, how in the world do you keep your heart alive when you're stuck in a waiting room? And many of us are entering a season where we would just say, welcome to the waiting room. We had friends lived way south of here. Their daughter got into some pretty significant trouble, substance abuse stuff, and was declared an unfit mom. She had a little boy. They immediately moved in to try to get custody of this kid. I think he was like a 2nd grader. Whole thing went into the courts. Courts are ready to throw him into the foster care system. They're trying to get custody, and it went on. And on, and on. File a motion, wait for a date, Date postponed, file another motion, wait for a date. Listen, welcome to the waiting room. How do you keep your heart alive when you're waiting? Walk in on the 17-year-old. There's a new man in the house, and it's not him. He just started his senior year of high school, and mom remarries. And he's happy for her. She's happy with this new husband. But it doesn't take him long at all to figure out that he's kind of infringing on the honeymoon. I mean, one clue was when he's thinking, I think I might live at home and just go to CC for a couple years. And they're recommending the University of Montana. There's a clue. Another clue was when they were sitting at the dinner table and they actually started a conversation about what to do with his room after he left. Should we turn it into a home theater or should we turn it into an exercise room? And he's going like, hey, I'm still here. But he feels like he's just kind of riding out his senior year. And a question mark as to what's on the other side. Welcome to the waiting room. In companies often reorganize because of downside. You understand what I'm saying here? I mean, loss of business, laying people off, and a restructure. There's also a restructuring that happens because of upside, where business is going so fast and people are being hired so fast that, okay, someone was the sales rep for the state of Michigan. Now we're gonna split this. And someone will be the sales rep for the western side of Michigan, and we're gonna start an eastern office, eastern side of Michigan, and some of you will be assigned to the office on the east side. And you said, assigned. That doesn't sound like a recommendation. You go, man, if I get assigned to the east side office, are we gonna move? Am I gonna uproot my kids from school? Or is this something, and there's just this question mark. And the decision, listen, your input is asked for. You get a voice, but you don't get a vote. And you wait, and you wait, and you obsess, and you think, and you got contingency plans off your contingency plans. If this, then this, if that, then that, and this. And welcome to the waiting room. Listen, the waiting room, if you ever get stuck there, the waiting room can be frustrating space, exasperating space, infuriating space. And the question is this: how in the world can you keep your heart alive to God? How can you have a healthy soul when you find yourself stuck in the waiting room? Now, in Paul's letter to the Philippians, he takes, and it's like 14 verses that the Apostle Paul takes in chapter 1 just to talk about his situation, what's happening there, and then his future and what he predicts is gonna happen in the future, which had some level of uncertainty. It could lead toward release, and it also lead toward execution. And so the Apostle Paul, as we read these verses from Philippians chapter 1, I just absolutely love his perspective. And my friends, I think it's gonna give us some huge counsel today as we talk about how to keep our heart alive if you ever find yourself stuck in a waiting room. And so what I'd love for you to do is to grab your journal, and we're gonna be on 15 today. And if you go, journal, I didn't know there was a journal. If you're joining us in the series this weekend, these are available at each of our campuses, in each of our atriums, at the Next Steps counter. Go to the Next Steps, grab one of these right after the service. There's a place to take notes and also reflect during the week. We need you to have this week after week. And today, page 15, Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 26. Basically two parts. Paul focuses on the present, and then he's gonna focus on the future. He's gonna talk about what's happening now, and then what could happen and what might happen, and kind of like looking out into the future. If you say, Paul, describe to me, I mean, you're chained up in this room, and this is, during a 4-year waiting room experience. Describe to me how you feel about this. He starts to describe his present, and the word he uses, the present, is opportunity. The present opportunity, which is huge, which is massive. So verse 12, let's just jump in there. We talk about the present opportunity and then the future possibilities. That's our breakdown for today. He says, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me, surprise, surprise, has actually served to what? Last 3 words, to advance the gospel. What Paul's saying here is, listen, I'm stuck, but the gospel's not stuck. The message of God's generosity is not stuck. I'm chained, but the message of the generosity of God isn't chained. I'm stuck in this rented apartment, in this room, awaiting trial, but the message of the generosity of God is on the move and spreading and making progress. Brothers and sisters, I want you to know something, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Now, the word the gospel that's used there in verse 12, where gospel means good news. That's what it is. It's good news. It's the good news that a generous creator stepped in to the broken and messed up planet in the person of Jesus. And that when Jesus is here, he generously sacrifices his life for us, dying on a Roman cross, to his death to cover our sins, to give forgiveness, to give life, to give a second chance. And because of the resurrection of Christ, he is alive and well and returning. And Paul's message is this: believe and follow, believe and follow, believe and follow. But the gospel, good news, a message about the generosity of God. He says, I'm chained. The message of God's generosity is not chained. How can that be? How can that be? You're stuck here, chained up in this room. The Apostle Paul is about to tell the readers in Philippi, his friends in Philippi, how the good news of God's generosity is spreading even while he's incarcerated. In verse 13, you would find these words. He says, as a result of my being chained here, it has become clear throughout where? Throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. He said, no, listen, because of my chains, because I'm stuck in this waiting room, it's become clear throughout, what did it say, the whole what? Be brave, say it with me, throughout the whole palace guard. I think there's somebody at the other end of this chain. Ryan, can you help me? Now, he wouldn't have looked exactly like this. The Praetorian Guard, it's a miracle. Let's see if I can do another one. There we go. The Praetorian Guard would have looked something like this. But when Paul is in this room, he is under custody. It's not just go to the apartment and sit there until your trial date comes up. It's go to the apartment, sit there chained to an officer of the law until your trial date comes up. And it was the palace, he calls it the palace guard, the Praetorian Guard. So fully outfitted and suited up, he would have looked something like this. Now look again at the verse. The Apostle Paul says this, as a result of my chains, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. I read somewhere that these guards would have rotated on 4-hour shifts, so 24 hours a day. That's 6 different guards a day that are chained to the Apostle Paul. They have to listen to him pray. Believers from the city of Rome are coming in for counsel, guidance, encouragement, and training. They have to listen to him interact. They listen to him say please and thank you. They see his courtesy, and they listen to him talk about the generosity of God. Now, the Roman idol system is this. If you ever run off to a pagan temple, it's in order to figure out what offering to offer to an angry God so that you can sway them to your side. You're about to take a voyage. You run off to the temple of Neptune, the temple of Poseidon, to offer a gift, because fundamentally the gods are angry and you have to find out what gift to bring to them. And Paul has this message of the God who came and gave himself for us. And they're absorbing this. And when they get off duty, they're talking. They're talking about how strange it is, and they're talking about how unique it is. Now listen, my friends, these are not what you'd call believers. But in the process of being chained to him, some of them are becoming believers. And so here's Paul, and he says, listen, I just want you to know, friends in Philippi, that what has happened to me, I'm chained, but the gospel is not chained. I'm stuck, but the good news is not stuck. It's becoming clear throughout the whole palace guard that I am in chains for Christ. But more than that, there are believers coming in, and check this out with me. It says in verse 14, and because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the good news without what? Without fear. And this is huge because this is Rome and because Nero is emperor. And a couple years after he wrote this letter, Rome is not a healthy place to be if you are a Christian. And already they can smell this coming. So here's the advice. Listen, man, if you're a believer in Jesus, keep a really, really low profile. Maybe you have a faith, but make sure it's a private faith. Make sure nobody knows. And through the interaction with people coming in and out of Paul's apartment, he said, because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear, because sometimes courage is contagious. And his courage is inspiring their courage, and his fearlessness is inspiring their fearlessness. He just wants them to know, listen, the gospel, I'm chained, the gospel isn't chained. The good news is not chained. I think Paul has a dual hope. One is that unbelievers will be curious, and the other is that believers will have courage. Because of his chains, unbelievers, curious, believers will have courage. I want to show you something. Very end of your booklet, if you've got the booklet with you. Or if you happen to copy of the Bible, find Philippians chapter 4. I want you to go to the very last study. This would be a week 11 for us. I think it's like on page 47. This is these people say hello, these people, greet these people greet you section that often come in Paul's letters. Page 47, way down at the end. Look at verse 20. To our God and Father be glory forever and ever, amen. Now listen, you Philippians, greet all God's people in Christ Jesus. The brothers and sisters who are with me send greetings. And then this in verse 22. We read this. Verse 22, all God's people here send you greetings. All God's people here send you greetings, especially those who belong to. There are now believers in the royal palace. Listen, all the believers here in Rome send you greetings back in Philippi, especially those who belong to Caesar's household. Now, here's a wonderful question. Do you want to have a spiritual impact on the royal family? Yeah. Are you sure? Ryan, thank you. Can you thank Ryan for it? Paul, how in the world do you have a healthy heart when you're stuck in this stinking waiting room going on 4 years? When you don't know how long you're going to be there, and you didn't choose this. And he writes to his friends in Philippi, I just want you to know that what has happened to me, listen, it's actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it's become clear to the whole palace guard. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters here are now encouraged to speak the word of God without fear. I think that Paul had a remarkable response because he was asking a remarkable question. The most natural question to be asking when we're stuck in a waiting room is this question: when in the world am I going to get out of this? When am I going to get out of this space? That's a natural and normal question. The remarkable, strange, weird, wild question that Paul is asking is this question: as long as I'm in this waiting room, what can I do to honor Christ? What can I do to make his name known? What can I do to see the message of his generosity spread to other people? See, he had a remarkable response because he was asking a remarkable question. Crazy, not all the people talking about Jesus in Rome had the best motives. In fact, if you were to read like down verse 15, 16, it would say, some preach Christ out of selfish ambition and out of rivalry, but others do it out of goodwill. It's like one quarterback is sidelined and on the bench, and it's a new quarterback's opportunity to shine, and he's so glad that that other one is sidelined. Paul is just saying, listen, it's their turn for the spotlight, and then not all of their motives are pure when they preach Jesus out of envy and rivalry, like to increase their personal market share. And you say, Paul, how do you feel about that? And Paul says, listen, I don't care. Literally, verse 18 rather, verse 18, he says this. He says, I've got to get away from verse. Okay, there's page 47. Here we go, verse 18. But what does it matter? What does it matter? He says, the important thing is that in every way, whether through false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this, I will, and what's the word he uses? I will rejoice. See, here we go. It's joy under pressure. It's joy under pressure. Joy is a focus on the generosity of God, which expresses itself through gratitude and praise, even in seasons of pain and disappointment. He says, listen, not everybody out there is preaching Jesus out of great motivation. He says, I don't care. As long as people are hearing about the crucified, resurrected Christ, as long as people are hearing about the generosity of God, I will, what does it say? I will rejoice. It's joy under pressure. But he had a spectacular response because he was asking a spectacular question. Most normal and natural question. When am I gonna get out of this waiting room? Paul's question, how can I elevate the name of Christ and see the story of his generosity grow as long as I'm in this waiting room? There's a friend that I've talked about before whose life has left a pretty profound impact on my own. This picture here was taken 2 years ago, this coming Christmas, and it was about a month before Scott died of leukemia. And Scott's journey, I remember sitting on his front porch talking with him one cold fall day. And Scott is saying, Jeff, I just want God to be honored with my life, whether it's being honored through my total healing or whether it's being honored through my dying well. I just want Christ to be honored and his name to be known, whichever way this goes. And Scott's journey involved months of hospitalization. A hospitalization where the grace of God working through his life empowered him to have conversations with people that moved through his room. We're not just talking doctors here, nurses, custodial staff. How are you today? Listen, to be nauseous from a chemo treatment and to ask someone else how their day is going. And it opened up all these opportunities for spiritual conversations with people who were curious, and many of them far from God. In addition to that, the care pages that Scott and Karen wrote about their faith journey during this time, those care pages have encouraged hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. Listen, sometimes your suffering is observed. Sometimes you have an audience, whether or not you want an audience. Paul, he's got an audience. It's the guards. It's the Christians that are coming for encouragement, counsel, or training. Unbelievers are curious. Believers are encouraged. But the decision as something is going down and you don't know which way it's gonna go, you don't know which mission you're on, to be able to say, you know, if this results in my total healing, I want that to bring honor to God. And if this results in me dying, I just want that to bring honor to God. But I want to honor God whichever way this goes. That was exactly the way Paul envisioned his future. And so we've looked at his present opportunity. The second part we want to talk about here is just the future possibility. Because if you're sitting in Philippi, if you're one of Paul's friends in Philippi, you go, okay, dude, you do understand, right? Nero can kill you. I mean, he's incarcerated as he's waiting for his trial to come. Once his trial comes, it was like release or execution. Those were kind of the options. And they say, have you thought about that? And I think Paul would respond by saying, yeah, I think about that all the time. I think about that every day. He didn't know when his trial would come up. I think there would come a day where someone would come to his apartment and they would open the door and they'd say, let's go. You know, your case is going to be heard today, and you go and you make your appeal, and if you get the thumbs up, they remove your chain and you're free, and if you get the thumbs down, you could be dead hours later. In imperial Rome, you didn't have decades of appeals. You could be sentenced at 9 and dead at noon. So when Paul talks about the possibility of death, it's not abstract theory. He simply didn't know for sure how this was going to go. So he talks about the future and the future possibility. There's an image here of a road that kind of forks. As Paul looked at his future, he says, this could go one of two directions. It could lead to my release, and it could lead to my execution. And I'm not afraid to die, and I'm willing for either. I just want God to be honored with whichever road this takes. So check this out with me, verse 20, I believe it is, where he says, I eagerly expect that I will in no way be ashamed when I go on trial, but I will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life, meaning release, or by death, meaning execution. And these were real possibilities. He says, whichever way this goes, I just want Jesus, the generosity of God to be known, and Christ to be exalted, Christ to be elevated in my life, whether it's by life or by death. So we have these forked roads, and just one of them's life and one of them's death, and he knew it was going to take one of these directions. And I think that he was thinking about this all the time. This is not abstract theory. This is about a person that could die. So just a moment here. Okay, listen, what's it like for you? Some of you, if we go just to the next, who are at that space, and you go, dude, I do not know which direction this is going to go at all. But you make a decision in that space. I will honor God if it goes this way, and I will honor God with my life if it goes this way. So help me God, and by his mercy in my life, if what happens, I am just so remarkably thankful and I feel release, then I will honor God in that. And if this goes south, by God's grace, I will honor God in that, whichever direction this goes. It's where Scott was. I hope that Christ gets honor with my total healing. And if that doesn't happen with my death, I hope Christ gets honor. It's what happens with the home business that you start, and it thrives for a while, and right now it's kind of teetering on the edge, and this has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours and your dreams and your time and your money, and you don't know whether it's going to make it. And just to stand here and be able to say, if this ends with being elated that this thing takes off, we will honor God with a successful business. And if we end up closing the doors on this thing, gracious God, give us the grace to be able to shut this down in a way that honors you. We hope to honor you either way. Is someone standing here approaching marriage counseling, and he's not sure his wife will actually go and show up? And he goes, if this leads to a totally revitalized marriage, if God rescues this, I will honor God every single day with our story and about how God resurrected our marriage. If she says, no, I'm done, I'm out, and she leaves and never comes back, but how can I honor you in my vast disappointment as well as in my elation? Because sometimes when we're in the waiting room, we simply don't know which direction it will go. And Paul just says, whether by life or by death, I hope Christ is exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. See, how do you keep the heart healthy when you're stuck in a waiting room? Paul had an extraordinary response because he was asking an extraordinary question. His question wasn't first and foremost, When am I going to get out of this? His question was, how can I elevate the reputation of a generous God regardless of what happens? That is an astounding, remarkable question. He would say in the next verse, verse 21, and this is kind of a famous verse in the Bible, he says, for me, to live is Christ, and to what? To die is gain. So he's looking at the two paths here, and basically that was release and execution. That was kind of what was in front of him. And he goes, to live, man, I'm gonna do everything I can to tell people and teach people about the generosity of God. But if they take me out, to die is, you're kind of like, okay, what's the worst case scenario? Well, the worst case scenario is actually the best case scenario, because then I'm with Jesus. To live is Christ, to die is gain. Now, let's take a moment just to riff on both of these for a second, because that whole thing there, to live is Christ. I just know there's a whole bunch of us that cannot say that with any certainty. And a whole bunch more that would just say, Jeff, to live is Christ. That's true some days and not true a bunch of other days. And even to break it down further, to live is Christ, you'd go, that might be true at noon and not true at 12:15. To live is Christ. And so I think a fantastic exercise this week. Again, grab your journal, and just page 18, there's just a chair in the upper left-hand corner. And that chair represents just time to sit, lower your pulse, lower your blood pressure, reflect. It's chair time, it's quiet time. And I would love for you to write this question down in your journal and just write, to live is. And I would just love for you to fill out some of the options that throw themselves your way. To live is sports. To live is a new restaurant dining experience. To live is adventure travel. To live is work. Work. To live is to check my cell phone every 4.5 seconds to see whether I'm relevant or not today. To live is. And just honestly before God, and just say, like, to live is Christ. Maybe it's true some days and not true other days. For Paul, I think he just latched onto this and says, to live is Christ. To live is Christ. So what's the competition? What's it like to have Christ at the center? And he is the big thing around which work and social media and sports revolve. But he is the big thing in the middle that forms and informs the other things. To live is, to live is. I've done something here, this next image. I just took this section of scripture, and we circled Christ every time it appears. I'm in chains for Christ. Some preach Christ, just as long as Christ is preached. Through the Spirit of Christ, Christ will be exalted in my body. To live is Christ, to die is gain. To die is to be with Christ. The dude is obsessed. He is. When we first open our Bible to the story of Paul, he's not Paul, he's Saul of Tarsus. He hates the Jesus community. He hates the Jesus movement. The first time we see Paul in the book of Acts, he is literally watching people's coats who have taken their coats off to kill the first Christian martyr, Stephen, by throwing rocks at him. And in order to get a better wind up and to keep from getting blood on your robe, you put your coats in a pile. Saul is guarding the pile of coats. That's how we're introduced to the Apostle Paul. I don't think Paul ever got over the fact that Jesus had rescued him. I don't think he ever got over the fact that Jesus loved him. I don't think he ever got over the fact that Jesus wanted him. And he spent the rest of his life talking about the generosity of God in Christ, the vast generosity of God, the grace of God, the love of God, the mercy of God. And so you look at this, Christ. The man was focused. This is why he wasn't afraid to die. talking about his two options, he would say this in verse 23. He said, look, man, I'm just conflicted about this whole thing. I'm torn between two. Now, I would desire to depart, read die there, and be with Christ, which is what? 3 words, which is better by far. But it is necessary for you that I remain in the body. Paul, your court case is coming up. How do you think this is actually going to go down? He says, I think I'm going to get out. I don't think my mission's done. I think that there are so many groups of followers to encourage. I think it's necessary for them that I continue to suck air for a while. It is necessary for you, but if I had my choice, I would depart. How did he describe death? To depart and to be what? 2 words. This is very important. Look at it again. I'm torn between two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better a little bit. This is better by far. Just observation here. Just notice the way that Paul talked about the life after death thing, the life to come thing. He didn't focus so much on what was in heaven, but who he would be with. He doesn't say, I desire to be away from this earth and in heaven. He said, I desire to depart and be, what was 2 words again, please? With Christ. I just want to be with Christ. Because often when we talk about, on those occasions when we talk about heaven, we talk about what's there and what's not there. I mean, sometimes people come up to me and they go, okay, Jeff, our dog, we had to put the dog down. Will our dog be in heaven? And of course the answer is yes. And we know that because this was resolved about 30 years ago when the movie came out, All Dogs Go to Heaven. So for those of you who are millennials and you don't remember the cartoon from the late 80s, All Dogs Go to Heaven. However, cats, how to alienate half your congregation in a single swoop. Don't get your hopes up. But we want to know what's going to be there. What's going to be there? And Paul goes, no. It's not just about the what, it's about the who. Jesus came for me. Jesus died for me. Jesus rescued me. Someday I get to be with the person who has loved me more fully than any other person ever could. I want to be with him. This was the same thing Jesus wanted for you. The night that Jesus gets arrested, the night before his execution on a cross, he prays. Did you know this? John chapter 17, there's this long prayer that Jesus prays. And first he prays for his disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, John. But then he turns a corner and says, Father, I want to pray for the people who are going to believe someday because of their testimony. That's me, that's you. And this was part of Jesus' prayer in John chapter 17. He said this, Father, I want those you have given me to be. The night, hours before Jesus is arrested, he's praying and he says, I just want them with me someday. I want them with me where I am so that they will see my glory. Father, the glory you gave me before this world was created, I just want them with me. It's as if Jesus is saying, heaven wouldn't be the same without you. I want you there with me. And Paul says, I want to be with him. I want to be with him there. Let me mention something. I have a sense there's a lot of parents in the room that would go, Jeff, honestly, dude, I'm really not afraid to die. I'm just afraid about what will happen to my children if I die and I'm no longer here to take care of them. No show of hands, but I'm very confident that if you're a parent of young children, that has gone through a bunch of your minds, anxiety over what would happen to your children if you were to die. I want to share something with you. My mom was killed in an automobile accident when I was 12 years old, as many of you know. My older sister was 13. My younger brothers were 9, 4, and 2 months old. My 2-month-old brother lived through the accident that took my mom's life. My dad was a small church pastor in the western states, And just kind of looking back on our family situation, I'm just kind of going like, I cannot think of a worse time for a mom to exit the picture, leaving a 2-month-old, a 4-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 13-year-old girl. A few years ago, standing on my back deck, this is a bunch of years ago, it's my brothers. I was 12, John was 9, Joel was 4, James was 2 months old, and Josh is a product of my dad and stepmom. So Josh was born when I was in college. John has an insurance office. Joel's a school teacher. James is a financial advisor. Joshua is an engineer. I got to be a preacher. We all have jobs. We have families. We're somewhat functional. Mom exited the picture. God took care of us. It was bumpy, and it was hard, and it was painful, and God was good, and he can be trusted. If you experience intense anxiety over the fact that if you leave the picture, what is going to happen to these kids? It's possible that you are just engaging once again in the journey of trust, and that God is asking yet one more time, will you trust me? Will you trust me? Will you trust me? And a lot of times our answer is yes, absolutely, but I just want to be there too, just to make sure you're doing your job. And God whispers, will you trust me? And just from my background, I say God can be trusted. So Paul, what would you say to us? I think he would say, listen, joy is an obsession. It's a focus on the generosity of God, which allows the heart to erupt in gratitude and praise even when you're stuck in a waiting room. It's joy under pressure. And I think Paul would whisper the words, don't let your waiting go wasted. Just, Andy, just play just a little bit of music for us as we close here. There's a friend that I work closely with. When he was 19 years old, he thought it would be a good idea to steal the automobile of his girlfriend's dad, along with credit cards, and drive to another state. Any predictions on the way this one ended? It ended with a 1-year incarceration in the Kent County Jail. And there, for a year in the Kent County Jail with very little to do, he came in contact with the Bible and in contact with another believer, and they walked through the pages together. And my friend came to faith, and it stuck. I think that's what Paul would whisper. He says, don't let your waiting go wasted. For those of you that find yourself hooked up to an IV tree or driving back and forth for tests, I would just whisper, don't let your waiting go wasted. Trying to get out of this apartment, this waiting room, into a house. Each time you put in an offer, somebody puts in a higher offer and you're stuck there. What if you're supposed to have a redemptive conversation with a neighbor that you will only have now, but might not have 6 months from now? Don't let your waiting go wasted. If you ever find yourself chained to a jail term, or chained to a hospital bed, or chained to an apartment, man, that's great counsel. That the heart can thrive when we're stuck in a waiting room. Don't let your waiting go wasted. And so I ask that our gracious God would be with you in your waiting. That you would sense his grace and his mercy and his generosity in your own spirit, and that would be channeled through you to people who are curious and to people who might be in desperate need of your encouragement. May God give you grace this week. In Jesus' name, amen. We'll see you next week.